Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And also on this podcast, we have political strategist, managing partner at Rood Peterson UK. That is Joe Tanner. Hello, Joe.
Hello.
Hello. And James Nation, who was deputy head of the Number 10 policy unit when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister and was a special advisor to Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor. James is now managing director at Forefront Advisors. Hello, James.
Hello, guys. Another quiet week.
There we go.
Well, not for me. Mine's been fueled by rosé, so I would say it's been slightly livelier. But
fantastic.
Anything to get through the silly season.
Tis the season.
Tis the season. This is rosé.
Can we find
season.
a rosé sponsor, please?
I would love nothing more.
Brought to you by Provençal, Whitehall Sources.
Whitehall Sources.
Yeah. And today we're live from the Mirabeau Vineyard in Provence. Welcome.
We could do a really cheap jingle with just some glasses clinking.
Again, fine
So
with
good.
me. I'll make it at the drop of a hat. So welcome to Rosé Season on the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we are all drinking through this uncertain, although slightly certain chapter, and the build up to Andy Burnham becoming Prime Minister. On the radio, we keep sort of caveating that because technically, in theory, there's a chance he won't be. I just think it's ludicrous. Andy Burnham will be the Prime Minister in just over a couple of weeks' time. And so this week, on the podcast, we're going to sort of chat about what we've learned about Andy Burnham this week and what we haven't, what we still need to find out about what he will do and who he will work with as Prime Minister as well. Your thoughts on Andy Burnham? What's your assessment of Andy Burnham? What will he bring as Prime Minister? What would you like to see him do? We will be talking about tax, etc. today as well. Has he got any room for manoeuvre? Which taxes will he go for? He says he's going to stick to the Labour Party manifesto, which promises not to raise income tax, VAT or national insurance on workers. So what do you think? Will he stick to that? WhatsApp us as you're listening to the discussion. The number is 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Whitehall. I think, Joe and James, we should take this back to Monday, which was Andy Burnham's big speech in Manchester, where he really set out, I think, broadly a vision. And perhaps that's what we should expect at this point in this process, is these kind of broad concepts. And I will say this, James, his slogan has stuck in my head, which is good growth in every postcode and hope in every heart. Now, make of that what you will, but it's landed in my ears and in my brain, certainly. In terms of what he said on Monday, when he spoke of devolution and he spoke of removing power from Whitehall and bringing it into regions across England particularly, do you feel you've got a better sense of Prime Minister Burnham?
So no, but look, it would be easy for me to sit here and be a negative policy Peter, but I don't really want to do that, right? So
what?
yes,
Hang on.
there
Can you
was
say that again, James? What?
I didn't quite get the alliteration right, but like a sort of negative policy Peter.
What
Let's
about
just settle on that.
pessimistic?
Exactly. Pessimistic policy Peter. There we go. And just, go straight to, you didn't really see, the hard trade-off set out on the fiscal or economic side. Where was the detail? But that wasn't the point of Monday's speech. People like me weren't really the audience. The audience was primarily the Labour Party, but also the public as well, just to convey a bit more of a vision, as you say, Calum, and a bit more of a kind of hopeful message, and just to look at that he's someone who is actually excited and up for the task, right? And I think, to me, you kind of see from Monday's speech that he is, as we were discussing with Jen last week, in a different league as a politician to Keir Starmer. And I think you mentioned the slogan that, as you say, has stuck with you. I would even argue it's easy again for me to be cynical about Number 10 North and are we really going to have 2 years or so of rearranging Whitehall deck chairs? But there's power in the idea. He's at least trying to say that I get it. I'm going to take some power and responsibility back from Westminster, situate that in Manchester. And he's really trying to tap into, I think, Calum, this sense that the public feel of they lack agency. They feel they lack agency, and there's this genuine sense of vulnerability. You see it in the cost of living crisis. You see it with a general kind of frustration over the lack of the country really changing. And so I thought rhetorically, his speech did the job on Monday, even if I still have massive questions over how he's going to confront some big trade-offs in government. And remember, I'll end with what I said last week. It's not the key period really at the moment, albeit we'll come to the LBC interview to judge the specifics of what Burnham is going to do as Prime Minister. That will come later when he's actually in and the Treasury are briefing him. Then we'll get proper clues. But I don't know. For me, politically, I thought Monday did the job.
Yeah. Joe, what do you think about that? This kind of broad vision. I do think there was a more optimistic tone to what Burnham was saying. The thing about him, I may have said this last week, the thing about him is it almost feels like enough for him to just not be Keir Starmer in the way he's conveying messaging right now. Do you know what I mean? In the same way that Starmer won from not being the Tories, actually Burnham is already doing well because he's not Starmer.
And I think, the funny thing is everyone's been like, how much is Burnham going to be able to deliver, or will he deliver on the Labour manifesto? And in some respects, even just the language and the way that he's presenting is actually presenting change. He's kind of coming in a way that is, I'm not your average politician. I recognise the one thing he's really doing is talking about how fed up people are and the disconnect between politics and the people. And that is something that Farage in some respects has sort of tapped into, because he kind of says what no one else is prepared to say, and that's because he's a man of the people and he gets it. And so I think the interesting thing is, while I'm always nervous about politicians that don't want to take questions from the media when they do events, the problem is he is in a very difficult position now, because he has put himself forward for this leadership. It's not his fault that nobody else has put themselves forward. So he has ended up with this sort of elongated period where, you would expect a lot of ideas, and he'd almost be forced to if there was another candidate. He'd be forced to be having a kind of back and forth with another candidate in a race. But because there isn't a race, he actually is probably trying to use more of the time to actually have a think about what the hell it is he wants to do. And I do think that there is a significant chance, from some people I've been talking to, there is a significant chance that what he's going to do is going to be somewhat radical. I think the use of, I've been saying for ages about David Miliband coming back. I've actually also, I was on another station, Calum. I was on LBC this week.
Sounds
and
rubbish.
I happened to say, it was a very good show, I have to say, but it was really funny because I said, well, what about like someone like Andy Haldane going into the Lords and going into a Treasury position and presenter Ian Dale,
formerly of the Bank of England.
Of the Bank of England. And he's been advising Andy Burnham. And Ian Dale straight away went, well, where have you heard that? And I went, I haven't, I've just made it up. But my point is, like, after Cameron going into the Lords as Foreign Secretary, the sort of, the rules are there to be bent or squeezed or pushed. And, there is definitely some, I think the reason we're not hearing about positions is actually because I don't think the government departments are going to stay the same. I think there might well be a sort of a Treasury person that sits at cabinet who is the Minister for Growth or something. Like, there's probably going to be something that's going to have to pull this devolution agenda together, because the Treasury and the Chancellor's got enough to do without also trying to have this devolution agenda and stuff. So that's where I think there is going to be significant change coming. And I think Burnham is waiting until he's got enough meat on those bones to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, James, what do you make? So personnel has definitely been something that's been in the air this week as well. So from that speech on devolution, on Whitehall, or decentralisation from Whitehall, I should say, there are these questions as to who is going to surround Burnham. And actually, let me just tell you this. We're recording on Friday morning, and Chloe Chaplin at Bloomberg, Burnham devolution latest, Rayner tip to return to MHCLG leading on Devo, so the Ministry for Housing, Community, Local Government. Louise Haigh widely expected to take on the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister type role in there as well. So that's fine. These are the kind of rumours and bubbling, and all the reporting is that, Labour MPs are absolutely clamouring. They're throwing themselves, basically, Andy Burnham, to try and get a job. The big one is Chancellor, and who will be the Chancellor. So a bit of that from you, and what you make of what Joe said as well.
Yeah, so look, I might be wrong on this, but I don't think you're going to see the breakup of the Treasury. I actually think that would be a mistake. So I think the trick with this agenda is, what can you do on getting key Burnham allies in key positions early to drive the Prime Minister's will? How do you make number 10 North effective, such as that is? But I think they will make a mistake, personally, if this becomes an agenda about, actually physically breaking up the responsibilities of the Treasury. I think the trick instead is, how do you have someone at the top of the Treasury in that Chancellor post who is going to actually turn the tanker, if you like, know the kind of pitfalls to watch out for from officials, and correct some of Andy Burnham's longer term frustrations, which have been, the Treasury isn't in favour of tax and fiscal devolution. The Treasury tends to underscore the benefits of investment in the regions. And that's why, for me, Calum, and I know there's a rearguard going on, I know he has enemies across Labour's coalition, I know there are strong views on him, but for me, Ed Miliband still remains the favourite for that role. Because I just think you got to think like you're Andy Burnham. And given what I've just described, I think he is still going to see Ed as someone who was in there with Gordon Brown, who, remember, as you and I we've been discussing on, in other forums as well, it's been Miliband behind the scenes in recent weeks who said to Team Burnham, hang on, why are you saying that about WASPy women compensation? Tone it down. He has been advising Burnham on various economic points. For me, he remains narrowly the favourite because he'll be seen as that person who can go in, grip the machine, grip the officials, and start to deliver on that agenda. And I'll just end by saying, I know Andy Burnham has said no appointments until he's actually in. Speculate as much as you like, and obviously we're guilty here. Sorry, future Prime Minister. But I do think they will have to confirm who is Chancellor slightly before he goes into Downing Street. Otherwise, this is your kind of day one story, which I'm not sure you really want it to be. I would sort of advise them, get it done, soft launch a few days before or a week before, so you can start to then hit the ground running with what your actual sort of start of first 100 days plan is going to be. But that's sort of how I see it, Calum.
See, that's why I think they won't announce just the Chancellor. Really? I think they will announce the economic team as a whole. Because I think if you just announce the Chancellor and the Chancellor is not popular, then I think you risk there being lots of questions. So while I wouldn't say I don't think they're going to break up the Treasury per se, but I think the idea of having some greater involvement of the sort of the regions or investment or whatever it might be, we saw an investment minister that resigned because she had absolutely no power. We've seen Lord Stockwood was appointed. We haven't seen a huge amount of him. And that was all about driving investment into the UK. So I think there is potential to kind of rejig the positions or how the departments work together to actually make something that is perhaps more effective, more joined up, creates the forums in which I don't think just doing it by cabinet committees works. I think Boris tried that. I think Keir tried that. It doesn't necessarily work. Maybe a Louise Hay in number 10 might have a role like that. I don't know. But it just, interestingly, while we've been on air, been recording, Holly Ridley, the General Secretary of the Labour Party, has just announced that she's stepping down from her post, and she's been working for the party for 20 years. So, I think what's interesting is that there are people I've noticed within Labour forums as well who are actually asking actively, who do you want? Who do you want to see in some of these positions? Who would you want to see in the cabinet? They are actively consulting about the potential for who might be Chancellor because they know it is going to be such an important role.
Yeah, I just think... So for me, if you look at this number 10 North announcement earlier this week, that's going to be tasked with doing 10-year plans to improve living standards or, working with local areas on public control in utilities, plans for regeneration. Again, I'm just going to be a bit sceptical the extent to which an entity like that, which I'm sure will be created and I'm sure will have a role and I'm sure will have other focal points into the cabinet outside of the Treasury, but it's the Treasury that still controls spending reviews and those cycles. So for me, the Chancellor appointment remains as critical as it ever has been because you are going to need someone on board to help drive that agenda. I'm just, the idea that an entity outside of the Treasury can do 10-year plans like that, I'm a bit sceptical. And then I totally agree, Joe, on the wider economic team. And I think you're right, actually, that Rayner no doubt would want her old job back, and I think Lou Haig would see herself as sort of Burnham's quarterback, if you like, of just helping to make Whitehall work on his behalf. I do just wonder with some of these other names, Andy Haldane, really, respectful, obviously huge record. I just wonder with him whether he fancies a tilt at the next governor of the Bank of England, actually, once Andrew Bailey goes. And I just wonder with Andy Haldane, if you come in to the inside, you have to give up the microphone. You can't be doing kind of public pronouncements and speeches really where you're going beyond the collective line. And so I think, there is just something for me at the moment, which is at some stage, Andy Burnham's going to have to crack the whip on message discipline a bit because, at the moment, we're just seeing these various names give their perspectives on things, which is fine. But you've then got to take the decision, am I actually willing to come into the tent and toe the line? So interesting time for sure.
But he's not going to whip James, apparently. We're probably going to have we're going to have one less person at the cabinet table because maybe they don't need a chief whip anymore because it's just going to be so collegiate and everyone's going to get on, so nobody's going to need to be whipped.
That is a mad idea. Maybe he just does it by a different name, but that's not going to happen. Surely, is it?
We'll give you a hug. The chief hugger at the cabinet or something. I don't know. Come and tell me your problems. And you still need somebody the thing is, the interesting dimension is that the whips do more than just telling people how to vote. They deal with a lot of individual problems that people have got. They do all the mechanics of pairing for votes. Like, it's not just about saying to people, you have to go in that lobby or that lobby. There's a much bigger thing. There is supposed to be, it doesn't always work like that, but there is supposed to be a significant welfare role that actually is carried out by the whip's office. So you do have to replace that stuff with something else. You can't just make it disappear. Whether or not it has a different meaning or different effect, maybe you could have a chief whip and a whipping system that perhaps is called something different, but actually serves to do more of the old political director job, where actually you listen more to the thoughts and the views of MPs, and that it's fed through a proper mechanism as opposed to having an advisor that does that political director role. Because that was one of the things that, if you remember when the welfare bill happened, one of the criticisms of Starmer was that some people had never met him. So,
yes, exactly.
The political director had a very difficult job. And one of the things that was given as blame for that was because Starmer had to be out of the country so much, which then in turn puts you back to perhaps the foreign secretary role is actually incredibly important. Because if Burnham is talking about being more domestically focused because of significant domestic challenges that he feels, structural things that need to change, that also lends itself to why the other Miliband brother may well be brought back as foreign secretary, because you actually need an experienced politician, somebody you trust, probably somebody that you've known a very long time. And what it does sort of look like is this kind of back to 97 band being kind of created with very key figures from those sort of Blair days being brought into a group that actually they probably have been to each other's weddings and birthdays and christenings and all that sort of stuff over the years. They've stayed, you know what it's like. You've worked in environments where those people when the chips were down really had your back. Now
Exactly.
that is why it's tempting to go back and find the people that you've actually probably sat and drunk a lot of rosé or red wine or whatever into long nights working out where it all went wrong and where the next lot have got it wrong and what you should be doing. You can totally see why you'd want those people around you.
Just on the logistics of some of this, the Telegraph's reporting this morning that the Chancellor, Andy Burnham's Chancellor, will have to spend part of their working week in the north to change their perspective.
Darlington. It's there.
Darlington.
Darlington's already there.
Honestly, highly commend it. Seriously, Beth Russell, who leads that, fantastic civil servant. People were so cynical at the time. I remember, Rishi did a briefing to Treasury officials before the budget to tell them, which rarely happens. That footage leaked because certain people were grumpy. It wasn't Manchester or Leeds. And I have to say, seriously, campus is great. It's done well at kind of catching, people commuting on the East Coast Main Line, people from nearby universities. So, yeah, I'm all for it. This is why I don't sniff at the number 10 North idea. I'm sceptical you're going to see a big rewiring of the state because he's not got too long before he has to go to the country, and that's an interesting question in and of itself. But I do think there is power here to just, having Whitehall sort of metaphorically come into contact with more areas of the country for sure.
And it's interesting because the Labour Party has always had an outpost in the northeast. They've had a Newcastle operation for years. So there are people in the system that are actually very used to having sort of remote or other campuses, as it were, and they've managed to function perfectly well.
Yeah, and there's no reason nowadays that these things shouldn't work. It is absolutely normal for everybody else in every other workplace to be here, there, and everywhere. There's no reason it shouldn't. Right, okay. The other thing, Joe, that you mentioned actually about Andy Burnham's speech on Monday was the lack of questions from the media afterwards. Now, I don't want to get too sort of inside baseball here and make it all about the lack of scrutiny, accountability, and hiding from the press. I could get on a soapbox about it, but I shan't. I mean, there is a political strategy in that, which is not taking questions allows you to stay on message and not be dragged in the direction that journalists want to take you. Wasn't the right decision, do you think, from Burnham? Do you understand the decision that Burnham made not to take questions on Monday?
Yeah, I think. I'm all for questioning of politicians, but I think they took the decision that they wanted the speech. And I hate speeches. I've always talked about how I don't like speeches per se, but Andy is very good at delivering them. Like Andy has he doesn't sort of, even when he's speaking, there is a sort of slightly conversational way in his delivery, which just doesn't sound as remote as some politicians do when they make speeches. So for me, there is something around his delivery which really works, but he wanted to make sure that his vision and the stuff that he wanted to communicate was the stuff that landed as opposed to the questions. And fundamentally, even politicians, members of the press, for example, or broadcasters that sort of made a snippy remark about him not taking questions, the public just kind of go, oh, well, like they don't really care in the same way. So, I think journalists often want the public to care, but I'm not sure that they do. And I think that's an interesting approach from him. But remember, he also then went on this week to last night go on to another station, LBC, and do an hour Q&A. And he's also doing this Reddit online stuff, which I've got to say, Calum, is giving me massive Boris vibes. Like when I did the mayoral campaign, we put off doing the Today programme for as long as we possibly could until the clamours got so loud that we were like, we're just going to have to do it. But we left it until like a week before the election, the actual polling day. But what we did do was we did online forums. We stuck Boris presenting a show on Talk Radio for like a whole 2 hours, which was probably the most nerve-wracking thing I've ever done. And I've done some stuff in my life, but that was scary. He even got a marriage proposal during it. It was the most bizarre. Ian Wright rang in at one point and started talking about young black boys and how like they were disenfranchised and stuff, and like how do you get them interested in sort of school and in careers and stuff. And it was amazing. Like Boris was so good in that forum that I can see for Andy that kind of, I'm interested that if he recognises that staying in touch with the public is going to make him a better leader, which I actually think was one of Boris's huge downfalls, that when he got into number 10, particularly with COVID, he didn't get that ability to connect with people in the way that he'd always done during his career before. I actually think it could be really positive for Andy.
I think that Boris comparison is always interesting, and it's actually, I mean, this is the second week in a row it's come up. James, shall we turn to the LBC interview last night, the sort of Q&A, where we probably learned a little bit more about what Burnham's kind of vision on things is, including on tax. So he says there is room for movement within Labour's manifesto on tax. He's been talking about his pledge to cut business rates for pubs, which he says will be funded by an increase in rates on warehouses used by the likes of Amazon. Overall, people can be certain of one thing with me, he says: I am not indisciplined when it comes to the public finances, which I thought was an intriguing phrase. I was in the Treasury. I've run Greater Manchester for a decade. You can't make it the fastest growing city region in the country without strong business confidence in what you are doing. So he says he is going to stick to the manifesto, but there's movement in there. Can you see the room for manoeuvre that he has?
No is the short answer. And I think, look, stepping back, I think even before the LBC interview, and I think we've talked about it previously, look, tax rises are going to happen this autumn. They're going to happen because they're going to want more space to do some cost of living interventions when you look at action to reduce bills, like I think, or cut bills. Burnham's been clear on that. You know, even on Monday, I think he said, I want to do what I can to create some further breathing space. And then also there's sort of a kind of ticking bomb in some of the plans that have been left. I'm not not referring to the defence investment plan this week, Calum, albeit that was interesting around the 4.7 billion that will have to be found at the budget. I don't want to overstate that. Like, that's, in terms of government spending per annum, that is not significant. But Team Burnham's reaction to it tells you that they are sort of feeling the pressure here. And that's because when you look at the kind of spending plans that Rachel Reeves has left, there are implied cuts to unprotected departments when it comes to day-to-day spending in those numbers. And that's another reason why they are going to have to find more tax revenue. And so we then come to what he said yesterday. And I think it was an unfortunate turn of phrase, because I definitely think the opposition parties are going to weaponise that room for some movement clip, right? And I think you can already see the Tories being fairly robust on that. But if we look at the specifics of what he said on business rates, I've heard this before because it's happened before. Increase the tax rate on factories and warehouses in order to cut taxes for the high street and for pubs. Rachel Reeves tried to do that, and we saw, I know you've had Make UK on previously before my time, guys. We saw that led to very real pressures on manufacturers, because if you're putting up the multiplier on factories and warehouses, it's hitting them. So there isn't a free lunch here. And so my view would be, if you want to cut taxes for pubs, you're going to have to fund it, and you're not necessarily going to be able to fund it within the business rate system, which then means finding cash elsewhere. And that then puts, a tax cut here in line with other areas that you might want to look at around cost of living support, other things that you might want to fund in terms of more money for particular government departments. And it just leads you to think that, unfortunately, Andy Burnham is going to face the same challenge which any Prime Minister and Chancellor would do with Reeves's fiscal framework, which is, the need to find more money, which is why we've got a tough budget ahead.
And that is the thing. So he says he's going to stick to the fiscal rules, but he's also going to build more council houses than at any time since that post-Second World War. I mean, there's a lot of spending that he wants to do, which, fine. But where are you going to get it from? While I was on air this morning on Times Radio, I was sent this, which is a letter published by the Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce, which, as you might imagine, represents a load of energy companies, supply chain companies, oil and gas companies, renewable companies in the northeast of Scotland. They've written to Bill Esterson MP, who's the chair of the Energy Security and Net Zero Committee, and they've also sent this letter to Andy Burnham. I won't read the whole thing. But basically, the Energy Committee were in Aberdeen and to hear from businesses. It was an evidence session they were doing in Aberdeen this week. And the Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce make the point that they they're urging the government to replace the energy profits levy with the oil and gas price mechanism, which has been designed by the Treasury in partnership with the energy sector. It is welcomed by industry, and it would provide a constant and consistent and stable windfall tax that the industry can understand. It's not chopping and changing. It doesn't change as frequently as the energy profits levy currently has. So that's the background. The sort of long story on this is from Offshore Energies UK, who say that if they were to do that, move to the government's own proposed oil and gas price mechanism, they would generate an additional £15.7 billion in tax revenues over the coming decade by unlocking investment and sustaining domestic production. And it just strikes me, I mean, they're reiterating that. They've said that before, but they're kind of making the point now. It just strikes me that there might be places he can get money from, but he's got to be willing to go for it. And clearly to kind of unleash the oil and gas sector would be a huge move for the Labour Party at this point.
But I just think if you're Chancellor Miliband, the way you will think about it, and I'm not like kind of trying to negate the analysis there. Actually, personally, Calum, I can see a lot of logic in terms of, reduce the marginal tax rate, free up more room for investment. But that's not how I think Miliband and the Treasury will think about it. Miliband and the Treasury will think we're in a cost of living crisis. The idea we're going to cut a windfall tax where, we might quibble over how much it raises, but we can be confident that money will actually be coming into the Treasury. The risk is that just gets scored as a tax cut and you don't see that corresponding activity boost on the business side. Again, I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying I think that's how they will think, because they will think we need all the revenue we can get to help us with the gaps we've got to plug.
Joe, when it comes to room for manoeuvre for Burnham, we've talked about the defence investment plan. We've got welfare in the mix as well. Feels to me as though there might be some room for manoeuvre with Labour MPs on welfare. A few of them have kind of posted in the last few weeks online, particularly saying, the last time they came for welfare reform, it just wasn't the right reform. If there were the correct reforms, as far as they would see, they might be inclined to go for it. Can you spot within his party, which, as we say, Patrick Maguire writes in the Times today, everyone and their uncles looking for a job in the cabinet at the moment. They're kind of flinging themselves at Burnham, and he's actually being taken aback by how upfront people are being, how explicit they're being about the jobs they want. Has he got room with his party? Can he bring them with him on this mission of his?
I think there is a bigger appetite for welfare reform amongst Labour MPs than has been sort of portrayed because of what happened before. I think it would be really interesting to see what the backdrop of the welfare reform would have been last year had they not done what they did on that first budget. There was just, I think the trust broke down so quickly that lots of MPs felt that there was sort of smoke and mirrors, or, were they going to be duped? They felt things were not properly thought through. They had very significant questions. And I think they learnt their lessons on the Sen reform stuff. I think they sort of tried to do much more to bring MPs with them in terms of being consultative and that sort of side of things. But fundamentally, there is a significant backdrop that even if you just take out sort of your traditional long-term disabled people from the mix of welfare reform, you've got this growing challenge around NEETs and where they fit in this whole sort of jigsaw puzzle, I suppose. And that is a group that is growing year on year, because for every year that the system isn't working properly, he's talked about devolving skills, right, as well, because he clearly sees that side of the agenda is not working properly. So it just, for me, I think there is going to be a really important way of rephrasing the whole discussion and the whole debate around what it is that you want welfare reform to achieve, and therefore how you get to it. And I do think that the fear of reform, the fear of being re-elected for Labour MPs is one that not only is something that scares them in terms of what if we go after our own too severely in terms of voters that maybe are on welfare but are traditional Labour voters. But I think the fear of the fact that these bills are escalating, the problem isn't getting any smaller, it's just getting bigger. I think that reality is starting to sink in. There are definitely Labour MPs that I've spoken to that were much more anti, that recognise now that this is just, I think, in a way, the defence investment plan actually, and the Healey sort of resignation and the sense that you're choosing, almost are you choosing one over the other, really became quite stark around that debate around the defence investment plan not having enough money when Healey resigned and said it wasn't there. And so I think that sort of the choices, the framing of the choices and the trade-offs, it feels like it's a little bit more stark for Labour MPs now. So I think he's got a better chance, but it's still got to be handled incredibly well.
Yeah, and I have to say, again, I know I started so positively, but I'm really sceptical here, I have to say, in terms of the actual savings that will be achieved. Let's break it down. Pensioners, I can't see the triple lock being touched. I think, he's been quite definitive on that. I know there's an increasing call from former politicians to go after it. I don't see it yet. I think that's a nettle that is going to be grasped when you can see the serious savings in the 2030s and early in a parliament, personally. So I don't see movement there. I think, Joe, you're right to highlight the health and disability benefits side. To get serious savings from the personal independence payment, which is the third biggest item of the welfare budget, you need to change some of these descriptors in terms of how you qualify. And I just think after last year, they'll be very nervous to do that. I can't see the TIMS review that's being co-designed with various groups and others really yielding options for significant savings. And then you're right, on NEETs, younger people, that's where the consensus is. I totally get it. But the problem is, to reform that, you've got to upfront invest in incentives for employers and then job support schemes. So actually, it's going to cost more money to reform it in the short term, which just makes me a little bit sceptical, notwithstanding the rhetoric, notwithstanding the emerging consensus that there is really going to be or are really going to be significant savings here, to be honest.
Just want to mention this from Simon French, the chief economist and head of research at Panmure Liberum, who says, fascinating whether Team Burnham will let this tax speculation, and there will be plenty, whether he likes it or not, run for the whole of the second half of this year into a late budget, or a sort of late autumn budget. The earliest you could have a budget, assuming it includes an OBR forecast, is the 28th of September. Last year's was the 26th of November. The latter had a clear impact on confidence deep into the, quote, golden quarter, says Simon French. Indeed, the pattern of the last decade is how the first half of the year, weighted both hard and soft UK economic data has been. James, I was just keen for a thought from you on that, because the timing of the budget, actually, I think you may have mentioned this before, could leave him space for an election if there's a real Burnham bounce when he gets into office, meaning that you're going to have to do a budget pre-election.
Well, yeah, I mean, I still don't think there'll be a snap election for what it's worth, but there'll definitely be speculation. On the budget, I hear what Simon's saying. I just think you have to believe that they would commission the OBR immediately as one of the first things that they would do. And I don't see that. There's a new chair of the OBR who's yet to be confirmed. They're going to be so focused on getting their feet under the table. And the date Simon refers to, that's Labour Party conference. Yeah. Right? And so his focus is going to be introducing himself to the party in the country. So I totally get it in terms of the speculation. And I do wonder, by the way, whether they're going to have to rule out some of the more creative tax options that have been mooted that do risk a behavioural impact. You've seen speculation around capital gains tax and income tax, for instance. So you may well see them have to clarify certain things they're not going to do in advance. But on the budget itself, I don't know, I might be wrong. I can see this running to a similar time frame as previous years, because I just think their immediate focus is going to be introduction to the country and conference.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, I think they'll push it as late as they can. They've got money to find. That's a lot of sofas to look down the back of before you're going to have a budget. So ultimately, what would be the value in going earlier? Because, you know, the markets wouldn't have anything in particular to react to if there's nothing being said. So there might be speculation, they might have to slap some stuff down. But actually, conference is about setting your agenda. That's where you set your big vision speech. So why would you make a huge one before? You'd want to push it to have as much time as possible. And if anything, you would do your shaping of the cabinet where, if my theory's right, and you have maybe a slightly controversial chancellor, but you bring in some other counterweight to that because of you bring in some other figures, because there was a good reaction to some of the names that were being talked about that were advising Burnham. There was a positive reaction. So if they are given some sort of role within the system, then you may well counter the kind of, oh, we're worried about this, we're worried about that. But you're not going to make any major tax pronouncements until you've got the budget, surely, because you're going to want to be able to say, and this is how we're going to raise this, and how this is how. You're not just going to throw out stuff in the meantime. So I think it's a tightrope he's got to walk.
I agree with that, Joe. I was just going to say, it looks like actually the situation for energy bills in the autumn and winter might not be as bad as previously feared, but I think there's the potential that you have to do something on the cost of living ahead of the October price cap on energy. Let's see. But otherwise, yeah, I just think for the reasons we've both said, I'm not sure about an early emergency budget.
Oh, guys, I've enjoyed this a lot. This is exactly what we like, isn't it? We've got loads to go at the moment. This is what we do every single week on the pod.
This is like fantasy policy politics. It's like, oh my God.
Fantasy fiscal.
I think we should don some, we should go like full Gypsy Lee next week and sort of just do a complete. If you had a crystal ball, what would be the most bonkers idea we could come up with? Maybe that's what we should get. We should get listeners to come in with some absolutely batshit stuff that we could just go, yeah, go on. Why not? Why not? If he wants a number 10 in the North, why not?
Hey,
your Q&A
welcome.
over a bottle of rosé. There we go.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe that should be our next live event.
Let's lock it in.
Sponsored by a rosé provider.
Sponsored by Whispering Angel.
In a vineyard.
Yeah, exactly. Joe and James, thank you both so much. That's been a real treat this week. There'll be loads more to discuss, I'm sure, on Andy Burnham and goodness knows what else this time next week on the Whitehall Sources podcast. Make sure you press subscribe, stick around, get all of our episodes as we usher in a new Prime Minister. Maybe it won't be Andy Burnham, but it certainly will be. And of course, you can keep in touch and WhatsApp us your thoughts, 0333 404 6507. Start your message with the word Whitehall. Or you can email hello@whitehallsources.com. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with someone you know, welcome them into the club as we get ready for Prime Minister Burnham. It's been great to spend some time with you on the podcast this week, and we will talk to you again very soon.